If you're not familiar with the doctrine of Christian discovery, I just want to kind of go back and highlight a little bit here that Pope Alexander VI, as well as Pope Nicholas V, when we talk about this age of exploration and discovery, word of Christopher Columbus's return about these lands previously unknown to Europeans, kind of brought this mistaken European belief of land that's not currently under the rule of a European empire now suddenly becomes open for the taking. And that kind of unnerved Pope Alexander VI, but he recognizes that there is this wholesale rush to kind of claim land that could lead to wars and damage some of the church power. So it's this fear of exploration that led him to write a number of papal bulls about this problem that could become a conflict from claiming lands that were not European lands. His most famous bull concerning indigenous peoples in these newly discovered lands for Europeans was the Inter Caetera papal bull issued on May 4th, 1493, where he declared his desire that barbarous nations be overthrown or subjugated and brought to the Catholic faith and Christian religion for the honor of God, his words, himself, and for the spread of the Christian empire. So now notice, if you're not Christian, you can be subjugated and brought to Christianity. So he's making it clear, the Catholic faith, but it's through that Inter Caetera papal bull that Alexander VI is providing Spain, at least, with the legal Christian authority to conquer all non-Christian indigenous, that should be capitalized, nations. And thus begins kind of this Christian doctrine of discovery. 21 years later, after the writing of Inter Caetera, there's an expansionist mindset in Spain that becomes part of the program. And so a Spanish jurist writes the infamous Requirimiento, which now gives the Spanish explorers legal authority to wage a just war against indigenous nations and peoples. So when the Spanish conquistadors found a new to them land, the priest who sailed on every mission stood at the edge of the village and read the Requirimiento, which described what would happen to you if you decide to accept Christianity and accept our rule over you. We will, in the name of our highnesses, receive you in all love and charity, and shall leave you, your wives, your children, and your lands free without servitude. But if you resist us, here's what will happen to you. I certify to you that with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of their highnesses. We shall take from you and your wives and your children and shall make, slaves of them. And we protest that the deaths and losses which shall accrue from this are your fault, and not that of their highnesses or ours, nor these cavaliers who come with us. So this is the Christian statement to native peoples, read to them by a priest in Latin or Spanish. And again, first contact, a lot of native peoples are not going to read and understand or speak Latin or Spanish. And so this is what then gives conquerors the just war. Well, they didn't accept, so now we're free to make them slaves, and now we're free to take their lands. Lest we think that that was a thing of the past, by the time we get to U.S. America, in 1823, the Supreme Court decision, Johnson and Graham's Lessee versus McIntosh, Supreme Court Justice Marshall notes, all the nations of Europe who have acquired territory on this continent have asserted in themselves the exclusive right of the discoverer to appropriate the lands occupied by the Indians. And he then asked, have the American states rejected or adopted this principle? And in answering the question, he says, conquest gives a title which the courts of the conqueror cannot deny, and that which was obtained by Great Britain have passed to the United States. So any lands that Britain possessed by our victory in the American Revolution, now the U.S. has title to those lands over native peoples, indicating that the tribes of Indians inhabiting this country, here's the racial characterization, were fierce savages, and to leave them in possession of their country was to leave the country a wilderness. Indian inhabitants are merely occupants to be protected, wards of the state, who are in possession of their lands but are to be deemed incapable of transferring their absolute title of their land to others. And so thereby is the decision now for this right of discovery in America over land. And the whole thing around the 1830 Indian Removal Act with Andrew Jackson was always about, well, have they improved their land? They're not using their land, so therefore they are not possessing their land, right? It's all about progress and showing the use there. So that's kind of a brief Christian doctrine of discovery that gets us to this point. Now I'm going to move to, well, what is religion? By definition, it means an end or a limit, a boundary. A definition tells us where some reality ends, and it separates the world into what is and what is not that reality. But given that emphasis on boundary, there's a reason why religion sort of eludes any definition. Religion can't be easily defined because it thrives both within and outside of boundaries. It crosses boundaries. So perhaps, I ask my students, maybe it's better to try to describe religion rather than to define it. And Western thought, and this comes from my book even, Western thought exhibits a disproportionate concern for a functional categorization of religion as an attempt to try to define meaning, rather than to explore this varied phenomena of religious experience. So in part, resistance kind of lies in that ambiguous nature of, well, what constitutes a religious experience? And what are the appropriate methodological tools then in order to study a religious experience? Well, part of our Western construct around religion comes from Clifford Geertz's work that puts it in that functional category. Well, religion, says Geertz, is a system of symbols which acts to establish powerful, persuasive, and long-lasting moods and motivation. And by formulating conceptions of a general order of existence and clothing these conceptions with such an aura of factuality that the moods and the motivations seem uniquely realistic. And his work motivates others to kind of come up and try to provide this functional definition. My work looks back at sociology. I claim that both race is a social construction and religion is a social construction. And I rely on Peter Berger's original work in his book, Sacred Canopy, that religion is a product of the society from which it springs. That is the sacred canopy from which every human society builds over its world to give it meaning. That's what religion does for people. It helps provide meaning for us. And we construct religion and religious practices and theological views to help us make meaning of something. That kind of moves us into this category too, thanks to Robert Orsi and Thomas Tweed and some others that talk about lived religious experience. And Thomas Tweed says, well, religions are just cultural processes whereby individuals and groups map and construct, right, and inhabit worlds of meaning. And then Tweed starts to add to that, they involve power as well. And others have picked up on that. I really like anthropologist Talal Assad's definition from 1993, that the cultural construction of the category religion involves power, that there are interests at stake. And so it might be useful then to view religion not as a characteristic that inheres in certain phenomenon, but maybe as a cultural resource over which competing interest groups can vie. So from this perspective, religion is not an entity, but, says Assad, a claim made by certain groups and in some cases contested by others, peyote, right to the privileges associated in a given society with the religious label. And it's that basis that I really do think that we have this cultural contestation over what constitutes a, quote, legitimate religion. We've asked that question of the Latter-day Saints. We've asked that question of the Seventh-day Adventist and the Christian Scientist and others whose court cases, right, have come before the Supreme Court about, I don't want to salute the flag and do the Pledge of Allegiance, and I don't want to take medical interventions, right? How does that all relate around religion? It becomes a power dynamic. And that's what we saw with peyotism, that the missionaries couldn't get people to come to church. But it also relates for peyotism around this idea of citizenship. That this reconstructing of fundamental conceptions of life with this socio-religious requirement of Christian citizenship that coincides with the federal government's efforts to absorb Native Americans into a population as citizens, that coincides with peyotism, and we're starting to question the Indians' then fitness for citizenship. Because at this point, they are wards of the government. And so the goal of federal Indian policy is to try to incorporate them into the national life as independent citizens, not as American Indians, but as Americans only. Thank you, Teddy Roosevelt, right? And so Indian identity and American identity suddenly start competing with one another, and it's the policymakers in the East that are dictating now the terms of the citizenship process. And so here's the thing. For Native Americans to progress from wardship into citizenship status in 1885, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs presents a list of requirements that Native peoples have to do. Own a homestead, give up your tribal affiliations, and get the homestead from the Dawes Act. And that's the second one, abandon the tribal relationship. Learn to labor and rear their families as white people. Learn their obligations to the government, to society. Notice here, possess a knowledge of the English language. This is the time when English only became popular with immigrants and Native peoples, because that's the only way you can comprehend the duties and obligations of citizenship. And then 4, give up your superstitions, forsake their savage habits, and learn the arts of civilization. And that last requirement of giving up the superstitious and savage habits proved problematic then in that cultural contestation over peyote. And it's that symbiotic relationship of church and state that's had a long history of policy and Indian affairs, comes from a Lott Grant's peace policy that allowed church officials from various denominations to have extensive participation in Indian policy, and an unofficial alliance by putting missionaries on all of the reservations. So that kind of starts that process of how missionaries got to be so influential in this deciding of citizenship status and deciding what became a good religion for Native peoples to practice. Now, one of the things in Oklahoma, that dichotomy with the boarding school, here we go, those great Christian nationalists as part of the Klan. This is a poster that came from the National Anthropological Archives, circa probably around 1936, with a warning to all Indians addicted to the use of peyote. Southern Oklahoma folks can't spell apparently, and other forms of heathen, sorry, Nathan, or pagan forms of worship. You are hereby warned to cease from such degrading practices. Our government has spent and is spending thousands of dollars each month to educate and lift up, is what it should say, Indians. And the Ku Klux Klan plans, KKK of this state, have determined that no Indian who has been educated by the government shall come back home and debauch his people. Take warning, the Klan in your community will look after you. So the Klan is watching to make sure that you are not practicing peyote. Now, at first, with the KKK, I was thinking the Ku Klux Klan, and I was really kind of wondering. I found out, and this is another work for later on, there's also another group operating in Oklahoma besides the KKK called the Ku Klux Klan, spelled with C's. And it came from a minister out of North Texas that spread into southern Oklahoma. So there's a separate hate group that combines with the Klan. So I think we're seeing some of that together. But, so here's my thought. One of the things I love doing this research, and you're going to see it more this afternoon in those last two chapters of my book, are Native American voices. They got to talk to newspaper reporters. They got to testify before congressional hearings, and their voices are recorded. And so Ned Brace, who was a Kiowa peyotist in 1908, summarized the importance of the intersection between this citizenship status and religion. And again, it's from 1908, his words, quote, take from a man, human, the opportunity to worship as they see the light, and you rob them of their proudest citizenship. When you take from a person their opportunity to worship as they see fit, you rob them of their proudest citizenship with their own native identity and autonomy, sovereignty to make those decisions for themselves. So in this cultural battle with government officials and religious reformers, then the efforts to organize a church and preserve their unique religious practices showed that they could be both productive American citizens and native peyotes. So that's kind of the case study, the connection there around religion and the Christian doctrine of discovery.